You're listening to the Converging Paths podcast, brought to you by Asia House and the Barakat Trust, with the support of the Al Tajir Trust and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture.
Hello, this is your host, Juan de Lara, Cultural Manager at Asia House. Today, we're very pleased to have as our guest Christopher Wilton-Steer, who is currently the Head of Communications at the Aga Khan Foundation in London. Christopher is a travel photographer and writer, and between July and November 2019, he traveled from London to Beijing overland, working on a project on the Silk Roads, which is currently exhibited in Granary Square at King's Cross in London until 16th of June. This exhibition was also created in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation, and today we have here Seif Rashidi, director of the Barakat Trust, who is going to help us to delve into the fantastic journey Christopher experienced and to discover the many things he learned during these months.
Hi, Christopher, and thanks a lot for being on our podcast series. We're really happy to have you, and it's a pleasure to hear about you and your work. So, to start with, can you tell us what you actually do and just give us an overview about this project, about the Silk Road?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. As you said, my name is Christopher Wilton-Steer. I'm the Head of Communications for the Aga Khan Foundation in the UK. I'm also an independent photographer. And the thinking behind this exhibition was to really tell a story about the Silk Road, about a variety of different people, places, and cultures that can be found along it, talking a little bit about its history, its heritage, the contributions various civilizations and nations have made to shared human endeavor, and also to talk about the work of the Aga Khan Development Network along it. We work in many different sectors, from energy access to the restoration of historic buildings, healthcare, food security, climate change. So this is really a broad, sweeping narrative about the Silk Road in the past, today, and also where it's going in the future.
Thanks. Well, can you tell us what the Silk Road actually is?
Sure. Well, I'm sure a lot of listeners have heard the term, the Silk Road, and it really dates back to about 138 BCE when Tang dynasty sent one of its generals westward in search of to make cultural and economic ties with the peoples of Central Asia. And in doing so, he really set in motion this sort of transcontinental trade route that would link China with, Central Asia, the Middle East and the West, along which people, goods and ideas would flow. And of course, things like the printing press moved from the east to the west, gunpowder, the magnetic compass, all sorts of different technologies, of course, goods like grain, leather, and of course, silk, and ideas, of course, too, and religions. And so 2,000 years ago, you would have Romans garbed in Chinese silk, and you would have coins minted in Rome with the face of Caesar being used for barter in spice markets in southern India. And so for about 1,500 years, it was really, as Peter Frankopan describes it, the axis on which the earth spun. So really, a lot of the more networked cities along it would become centers of culture and learning. And in some, you'd have ignited kind of golden ages. And so you'd have this amazing kind of cultural explosion along it. And then by about the 16th century, they became less prominent due to maritime trade links, which were safer, quicker, and probably less expensive. And so some of the Silk Road and its exchange and trade that flowed along it really lost some of its luster. But that legacy of exchange never really ended. And then today, as some will have heard of, China is investing trillions of dollars, along with many partners who are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so the Silk Roads are really rising again and becoming more and more interest again. These huge infrastructure networks, roads, bridges, rails, pipes, connecting Europe and China once again. So there's a sort of renewed interest in the Silk Road today, and this exhibition is part of that.
Thanks. I was intrigued to find that actually your journey started in Venice. So can you tell us why Venice is the first starting point along your journey and where you went from there?
Sure. Well, Venice was one of the westernmost hubs of the Silk Road trade, a sort of terminus of sorts. And Venice, it was established in the 7th century as this lagoon city. But by the 15th century, it started to develop very, very strong trade links with the Safavids in Iran and the Mamluks in Egypt and Syria and the Ottomans of Turkey. So through those trade links, it wasn't just, of course, goods that flowed into Venice, but ideas too. And so you see all sorts of influences, especially from the East, in the food of Venice, in its architecture. You'll see in some of the domes of, there's one church in particular, the dome at the top of its spire looks very much like kind of Mamluk era mausolea in Cairo. On the lanterns on top of St. Mark's Cathedral, some art historians say echo those that you find at the top of minarets in Cairo. And then, of course, on the Doge's palace, you have these amazing lozenges of tile work which cover the whole thing, which is pretty unusual in European architecture. But you see that type of tile work and patterning on buildings in Uzbekistan, and the belief is that this is a sort of pastiche of what was happening in Ilkhanid dynasty in Uzbekistan, and these ideas were brought along the Silk Road. Similarly, in paintings of the Renaissance, you find those beautiful blue pigment the Madonna is usually garbed in, and of course at that time in the 16th century, when those paintings were being produced using pigments from lapis lazuli, the only place in the world where that was being mined at the time was in northern Afghanistan and eastern Tajikistan. So these were traveling 6,500 kilometers down the Silk Road to Venice and then ground up and turned into these beautiful paintings. So there's this real culture and legacy of exchange in Venice, and that's what particularly drew me to it, and I wanted to capture through my photographs.
And moving on from Venice, you went on quite a long journey by foot, I believe. And can you tell us a bit about where you went, what it was like, and some of the more unfamiliar and memorable things that you found there?
Sure. Well, I'd like to say I did it all on foot, but that's not quite true. It was mostly by car and by train and bus, and if camel was needed, then camel also. But yes, I traveled about 40,000 kilometers, really actually from London to Beijing through 16 countries. And so Venice was one of my first stops, and then crossed the Adriatic down the Dalmatian coast through Dubrovnik and into Bosnia and Herzegovina to the city of Mostar with its beautiful Starry Most Bridge, which was an old town which was partly restored by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture after the war in the 90s. And then through the Balkans, through Montenegro, Serbia, Bulgaria, and then into Turkey, across Turkey, Istanbul, and to the southern cities along the Syrian border, Gaziantep, Sanliurfa, Mardin, and then to eastern Anatolia, to Lake Van, where you have this wonderful Christian heritage from the 10th century from the old Armenian Christian kingdoms, and then across the border into Iran, into Tabriz, where you have the largest covered marketplace in the world, where Marco Polo stayed in the 13th century at one of its 22 caravanserais. There's still people using abacuses in that bazaar. It's a really wonderfully old-fashioned place. And then down to Sultaniye, where the Mongol general Urjaitu built his mausoleum in 1312 after he had converted to Islam, and brought with him this kind of Central Asian architectural aesthetic. You see these beautiful turquoise domes and stylized Kufic calligraphy around its drum. And then through Tehran into Isfahan, beautiful Isfahan with those mesmerizing mosques, which were partly decorated by Shah Abbas I using artisans that he brought in from China because they had such incredible skill in producing geometric tile work or patterns. And then to the south through Yazd and into the Lut Desert, the hottest place on earth, where it was about 55 degrees and about 70 degrees, that's Celsius, about further down the road. So it was kind of nauseating heat, but I had to go and see it. It looks like the surface of Mars there. And then up north through Mashhad and into Turkmenistan, where you have these crazy city of Ashgabat, where it's this marble-clad city with this super futuristic architecture, which actually kind of blends this Islamic architectural motifs, as geometric motifs, but with kind of Soviet futurism, which is really spectacular. And then across the Karakum Desert into Uzbekistan, into those beautiful cities of Khiva, Bukhara, Samarkand, real Silk Road heartland there. And then into Kyrgyzstan, those lush sweeping valleys. It's like a land before time there. It's where I stayed in beautiful yurt in Songkul, and then into Tajikistan, Murgab, in this very high plateau where it's pretty hard to breathe. The the mountains there are kind of very gentle where it's very high. And then when you get into the lower Pamirs, they're more sort of violently burst out of the earth. And then, of course, I couldn't cross over the border to Afghanistan because of security concerns. So I did actually have to take a flight at this point. I had to make my way back to Dushanbe and then took a 7,000 kilometer detour via Dubai to get to Pakistan, landed in Islamabad, and then went up to Baltistan in the north, where you've got the Himalayas, Hindu Kush and Karakoram mountains meeting. It's a truly dramatic, amazing place. You have these phenomenal mountains, some several over 7,000 meters, K2, Rakapushi, Nanga Parbat, Dirin Peak, Golden Peak, these things, these sort of legendary mountains where all sorts of beautiful forts up there, several restored by the Trust for Culture. And you can stay at some of them. And then up the Karakoram Highway to the Kunjarab Pass, the highest paved border crossing in the world. And you can see this giant gateway, which is in the middle of nowhere with these Chinese flags billowing from it. And that's the gateway into China, into Xinjiang province, into Tashkorgan, into Kashgar, this legendary Silk Road town, which was the sort of gateway for Chinese traders going to the markets of Central Asia and vice versa. And then across the Taklamakan Desert, into the Gobi Desert there, across to Xi'an, which spent a lot of time in the Muslim quarter there, which was one of the capitals of the ancient capitals of China, and then finally to Beijing. Sorry, that probably went on a little bit, but hopefully some descriptive powers there gave you a sense of what was along the way.
How long did it take you?
Yeah, it took me 4 months, and so I really didn't spend more than 2 or 3 days at most places, which is not ideal. 6 months would have been preferable, but I had a bit of a time limit, so 4 months it was.
And were there any specific places or ways of living that were particularly striking or thought-provoking as someone coming from a city like London?
Yeah, I think I often talk about Kyrgyzstan as a country that really blew me away. It just, it's never quite what you imagine it's going to be. And it was just these vast valleys, much more gentle landscapes than Tajikistan, which has much, or northern Pakistan, which has much sharper, taller mountains, but just sweeping valleys, beautiful, tons of horses in them, camels, yak. And of course, in the rural areas, a lot of areas are where semi-nomadic people live. So just little white yurts dotting the landscape. And then they move with the seasons. So when it gets too cold, move on to the next place and you pack it up. And your sort of touch on earth is very gentle. And it's a very harmonious way to live. And I had never witnessed or experienced something quite like that before. And I found myself just wandering for hours, just in my own thoughts, but in these spectacular landscapes, and took lots of photographs of horses and horsemen. And it's just a different way of life there, but I really enjoyed it, my experience.
And you told me that you actually slept in a yurt. How was that bit of it?
Yes, well, it was pretty cold. I mean, the interior is lovely and beautifully colourful and, plenty of space. But after dinner, I was getting pretty nippy. And so I went to my yurt, got into bed, realised it was pretty cold in the yurt. So I was wearing all my clothes and I was in a sleeping bag and they had lots of rugs. So I put all of that on and didn't get a huge amount of sleep because it was pretty chilly. But then at about 4 or 5 a.m., the entrance to the yurt opened and I could see, no one had warned me that somebody would be coming, but I suddenly saw this man's face at the door and it was glowing with this coals that he had brought. And there was a stove in the yurt, so he fired that up and that was a welcome respite from the cold as soon as that warmth started to fill up the yurt.
And when you were describing the journey that you took, which people traveled for centuries, it's quite an extensive route or routes. And I was wondering what kind of infrastructure made that possible? I mean, was there an infrastructure or did the travelers hop along from one place to the next, hoping to find places to stay? And I mean, how well prepared was it in medieval times or even in ancient times?
Well, I think different parts of the route were better serviced than others at different points in history. But there are some, certainly from Turkey and Iran, there are still many caravanserais still exist today. And I visited a few in both countries. And they were typically kind of travel lodges where merchants and travelers would rest, would wash. There was usually a mosque there so they could pray. There was a vet who could look after your horses or your camels. You would share gossip and news, and you were also outside the cities required to quarantine in some of these, and because of course the plague and other illnesses traveled these routes with the people that traveled along them. And these caravanserai were typically built about 30 kilometers apart. So that's a day's journey, more or less. And in Turkey, some of them are still, you can go and still stay in some of them. And you can go, there's some have restaurants still in them. So it's amazing to see that their use is still, whilst not perhaps exactly the same, is still partially the same. And so that was wonderful to see. And, you know, I read somewhere that there were over 1,000 caravanserai in Iran during the Safavid period in the, say, 16th century. So they really invested in those too. In Kyrgyzstan, I found one in the middle of nowhere called Tashrabat, about 200 kilometers from the Chinese border. And presumably there were others perhaps near it, but that was pretty isolated. And then in parts of northern Pakistan, where the Karakoram highway is going, on the opposite side of the valley, you can sometimes see this little line snaking the side of the mountains. And that's really an original Silk road or tract. And it's perilous. You know, it was the way that people traveled around the mountains before the Karakoram highway was built in the 1970s and 80s by the Chinese and Pakistanis. And so amazing to see parts of that, which has been partially restored in places as well.
And with such a network and this idea of having caravanserais every 30 kilometers, did you find commonalities in the culture in some ways across the route that you traveled?
Well, I think as soon as you reach Turkey, and I suppose, you know, the culture of hospitality, whether it's part a geographical thing, it's partly I think an Islamic thing, is, you know, people want to offer you tea or coffee or food or whatever it is. So there's a wonderful hospitality culture that I encountered from Turkey sort of onwards. It's also interesting kind of tea culture that I suppose Western Europe has transitioned from. I mean, I suppose tea is still drunk a lot, but it's kind of a coffee culture. And Turkey has both, of course, but people will drink tea all day long in those lovely little small glasses, and similar in Iran as well. And then I guess Central Asia is a real tea drinking culture as well, lots of green tea. And so there are those kind of commonalities there.
And are there any rituals associated with the drinking of tea or the serving of tea?
I'm not sure, but you're expected to drink a hell of a lot of tea. There's constant tea being poured. So maybe the trick is not to finish your cup each time.
Yeah, it's funny. I met some people from northern Pakistan once, and I was very surprised to see them put salt in their tea. And I said, no, you've mistaken it for sugar. And then I realized that even though it's a drink that's drunk around the world, people drink it and consume it differently.
Absolutely, yes. I think I had some of that salty tea when I was there.
Well, I guess what's of great interest to me is also the process of capturing your journey as a photographer. And also selecting photos is also about the experience of what you saw. So I wondered if you could tell me about a memorable experience, and also if I gave you the difficult task of choosing one photo to capture your whole journey of 4 months, what would that photo be?
Ooh, difficult one. Well, I suppose, a memorable experience, one might be, when I traveled from northern Pakistan to China, the last sort of town, this frontier town, is called Sost. And there's what they call a dry port there, which is where the trucks are all kind of processed before they cross over the border both ways. And it's kind of like an old Western town. You've got these roads and there's shops on either side of them, and people are bartering, buying cigarettes, and there's signs everywhere sort of proclaiming the Chinese-Pakistani friendship. And to get to China across the Kuntra Pass, you have to take a minibus, unless you're a trucker of some sort. So I sat in the front seat with this old man, and he was, Pakistani man wearing a shalwar kameez, pakol hat, and I had some dried fruit, some apricots and cherries, which are pretty plentiful up in the north of Pakistan. So I shared those with him. We didn't speak each other's languages, but he kind of, he was appreciative with his nodding. And then once we reached Tashqorgan, we kind of went our different ways. And then several days later, I was in Kashgar and walking around photographing people, and I saw him outside a shop bartering with this Uyghur shopkeeper. I think he was a Uyghur shopkeeper. He was wearing a traditional hat, and they didn't even speak each other's languages, but they were kind of, they were using sign language, and they clearly knew each other quite well because they were sort of, almost fighting with each other in a funny way. And the old man had a suitcase full of like antiques, which he was showing the guy, and they were negotiating prices. And it was like extraordinary. I was kind of like, I'm literally witnessing this kind of cross-border trade, which has happened for millennia. And it's still happening, in this very small way now, with this old man still crossing the border, selling his stuff to this shopkeeper in Kashgar. And it was really extraordinary kind of scene to witness. And then when he finished, I sort of followed him as he left the shop and tapped him on the shoulder, and he just, turned around, and then he wasn't quite sure. And then suddenly a big smile of recognition appeared on his face, and he sort of jumped up and bear hugged me and had this wonderful moment with this man. And then, we sort of walked away kind of looking back at each other, sort of, looking out for each other. And yeah, it was just a wonderful experience and moment that. And then what image sort of sums it all up? And image I use a lot is of the ceilings that I shot in Iran. There's one in the Sheikh Lotfullah Mosque in Isfahan, and I like it because it not only demonstrates the sort of brilliance of the artists who produced it in the 16th century, but also the principles and what it's based. These Islamic geometric principles that were born out of advanced mathematics coming out of the Islamic world at that time, and part of the heritage of that part of the world. But also, I from what I understand, is that some of these techniques and methods were also informed by Chinese artisans. So it wasn't a sort of an isolated artistic style. It brought in different influences, and that's really what this exhibition and what my interest is about. It's about those links between different cultures and what we learn from each other.
It's interesting what you say. One thing that also piques my curiosity is you work for the Aga Khan Foundation, which is a development organization. Mm-hmm. So from the perspective of the Aga Khan Foundation, why is an exhibition like yours important and relevant today?
Well, I think for our organization, the value of pluralism is incredibly important. And that value being that our differences is what make us stronger and should be cherished. And so this exhibition is fully a demonstration of part of that, or that it instills that feeling as you walk around it and see some of the photographs. And also that these are regions, particularly Central Asia. I mean, South Asia people probably know quite a lot about. But Central Asia, from a UK perspective, is not an area that is visited that often. It's not an area that's known about that much. But it is an area of great significance historically and increasingly in the future. And so it's an area we work in, and we want to raise the profile of that region.
And what kind of work do you do in those regions?
In Tajikistan, for example, well, it's really Tajikistan and Afghanistan, because what demarcates the border is the Pyanj River. And this was one region, but one is called Gorno-Badakhshan, one's called Afghan Badakhshan. And you'll have cousins or brothers and sisters or family members on both sides of the border. And in 1895, I think it was, during the Pamir Convention, British and Russian empires separated these two areas. And their development trajectories after that are hugely different. The Soviets invested a lot in Tajikistan comparatively, in infrastructure, in education, roads, etc., healthcare. And on the Afghan side, it's a completely different story. And so AKF works a lot in both of these regions. But one of the interesting projects is around cross-border trade. And so over the last 15, 20 years, we've built, with our partners, 6 cross-border bridges that cross the river, and at either ends are markets, and traders can trade at them visa-free. And also Afghans who need critical healthcare, instead of traveling 200 miles through the mountains on treacherous roads to get to the nearest health center can cross over the bridge and get emergency medical care from Tajik doctors, again, visa-free. So, this is one example. Another is around the provision of energy in Tajikistan after the fall of the Soviet Union and the civil war that followed. A lot of the energy infrastructure in eastern Tajikistan fell into massive disrepair, so that only 13% of the population there had access. And of course, it resulted in a lot of deforestation, and which then has subsequent issues around, landslides and all the rest of it, because people needed food to cook and keep warm. And so since 2002, AKF, with a company called Pamir Energy, which is part of the Aga Khan Development Network, has been restoring that infrastructure and expanding it so that today 96% of people have access to electricity. And since 2008, they've been exporting it across the border to Afghanistan to communities who have never had electricity before. So it's an extraordinary kind of catalytic impact that having electricity does, as we can all take for granted every day of our lives today. And I met a lady in eastern Tajikistan called Hamida a couple of years ago, and she had just moved back to a village called Day, and she had been living in Russia since 2006 with her family, as a lot of Tajiks do, work in Russia and send remittances back outside of Moscow. And she had come back, and I said to her, what's brought you back? And she said, well, we now have electricity, so I don't need to go and, wash clothes in the stream. I don't need to go and find firewood, which would take up several hours of the day. I'm free to spend time with my family, to have another income or take a job somewhere. So, these types of projects are really catalytic and fascinating to meet some of the people whose lives they've been impacted as well.
And the semi-nomadic ways of life that you mentioned, for example, how fragile are they? Is there a possibility they might disappear, or are there ways that one can benefit from electricity and modern infrastructure, but also retain traditions that have survived for so long and are so sensitive to the earth and to the seasons and to nature?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I can give a full answer to it, but, the power of modernity and this sense of us, of this sort of homogenous lifestyle that we're heading towards, it does not bode well for the kind of diversity in the world today and the value that brings us. I just give one example, because for the semi-nomadic communities, some of them in Kyrgyzstan, for example, one thing the foundation is doing to support those in a way is to create mobile libraries and mobile early childhood development centers, so that as those communities move with the seasons, they also have yurts that contain books and learning materials, and teachers who are trained within the communities can travel with them to ensure that children have access to great learning materials and opportunities as education opportunities as they start to grow older.
To make it easier for them to benefit from things like education without having to sacrifice their traditional lifestyle to do so?
Yeah, exactly.
And you also mentioned that your exhibition includes crafts, and that you're going to have kind of a bazaar with the exhibition. Does your work also involve reviving local crafts or preserving traditions in that way?
Well, this is a great personal interest of mine, but also a professional interest for the foundation and the broader Aga Khan Development Network. For me, artisan crafts hold a deep value wherever I travel to, because, craft, just through the techniques that people use, the technique that they might use, whether it's glass blowing or lantern making or carpet making, that technique may itself be hundreds of years old or even thousands of years old. The designs that people produce also tell stories about a communities or regions past. So really, craft for me is a way of looking into the past. It's giving you a kind of telescope into the past, and there's something valuable in that. And also, of course, the products that are produced, I tend to collect them and enjoy them, and so it says something about our past and about our diversity, and so visually, of course, that it's very. I love to take photographs of artisans because it just looks so interesting. And then, as an organization, the foundation and the Trust for Culture support artisans in all sorts of shapes and forms, and in Cairo, for example, in Al Dawa Al Ahmar, a lot of the artisans there have been supported through microfinance programs, because the threats are there. Globalization, the raw cost of materials going up, changing tastes. We're losing a lot of this heritage every day. And so in some small way, I hope the photography helps raise awareness about it. But also, as part of this Silk Road project, as you mentioned, we are planning on having a Silk Road Bazaar in the King's Cross area. It's just 10 stalls of UK-based vendors who import products from artisans in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, and other countries. So you'll be able to buy kind of Central Asian hats and beautiful homeware and all sorts of stuff. But it's a way to try to support those artisans and also link them to markets where I think there's a great interest in those sorts of products.
And I mean, you took thousands of photos on your journey. And how many are in your exhibition?
About 160.
Okay, how did you choose a selection of 160 to capture all of that? What were the thoughts in your head as you were selecting?
It's a brain-numbing process. It's a painful process. I took about 50,000 photographs, so distilling that to 160 is hard. And often I think, how on earth did I do that? Did I just pick some random ones and just tell a story? I mean, if I was to do the exercise again, would I select something completely different? I think, I had to keep in mind what my overarching narrative was. I needed things that spoke to the history of the Silk Road and its role as this conduit of trade and flow of ideas and people and religions, and wanted to show the connections between cultures. So that was the sort of overarching narrative. And then, of course, you want to select the images that stick out the most, or that you think people are most visually pleasing. And like I mentioned about that old man, it wasn't the most visually pleasing photograph. And so I had to admit that. But I hope to have a mix of people, places, and cultures, really, and landscapes, because I could easily focus too much on one of those things. And so wanted to have a nice blend so that people could see the diversity of faces, they could see the diversity of art and architectural styles, they could see the diversity in landscapes that you find along it. And so hopefully that comes through in the exhibition. And to be honest, I created a Silk Road living history website because I realized that there were so many stories I could tell, so many photographs I wanted to show, that I wanted to create a kind of resource for all of that, so that people, if they wanted to go a little bit deeper, they could. And so whereas I will have one photograph of a ceiling from Isfahan, in the website you can find 20 of them from different places. So over time I want that to build, and as the exhibition hopefully travels, it will continue to be a resource for those exhibitions as well. And really the physical exhibition is the tip of the iceberg. The website has loads more content on there, and photo essays and all the rest of it.
And presumably your exhibition will travel to places where people are quite unfamiliar with the Silk Road and the regions that you covered. What do you hope that the average person will get out of it?
Well, hopefully to get a curiosity about parts of the world that may be less familiar. I've had a lot of emails recently from people I don't know, just saying, wow, I want to do this. Like, how do I do it? So I think encouraging others to take that path because it's an education really for me doing this, opened up my horizons hugely, and it's a deeply enriching experience. So there's a humility that comes with wanting to learn about other cultures and seeing the value of them. And so I hope that the exhibition sort of, instills that curiosity, and people are keen to sort of read more about these regions and hopefully travel to some of them when we can again.
For someone like you who presumably travels a lot, but probably not for 4 months, taking slow means of transport, what did a journey of that sort, how did it enable you to see the world differently?
Yeah, I decided to travel overland rather than to fly to different places, because when we fly, you drop into these different cities, different parts of the world where things are completely foreign and alien, customs, language, food, and that's part of the excitement as well. But I wanted to travel overland because I wanted to experience those sort of transitions between cultures so that it felt natural where I was, or hoped I would feel that way. And I did. I found myself in far-flung Tajikistan, but I had come over land. I'd seen the landscapes change. I'd seen the customs kind of transition. And so I felt, so I just felt like at home wherever I was. And so, with the people I met along the way, I mean, everybody's lives slightly differently, has different religions or food and customs. But we're all ultimately wanting the same things in life, which is to be happy and to ensure that we and our children and whoever else are safe. And that sense of that doesn't change wherever you are in the world. That is who we are as human beings, and that is the fundamental value we all share, which is a cherishing of life.
And presumably, the experience of interacting with many, many different communities over a long stretch of ground emphasizes that the commonalities that are greater than the differences.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to see the differences because they can be very visible in lots of different ways, and to assume, it is people who live differently. You wonder how to fit in, and that can then be scary and make me react like I'm not sure I want to be here. I don't know what this is about, but that's a sort of fear. To try and overcome that, I think is something we should all try to do. And once done, and I think it's done through showing some humility as well, then suddenly a whole world of wonder and connectedness can hopefully open up to us.
Yeah, I think being open and willing to accept and to experience and to immerse oneself is probably the best way of discovering all these things that would otherwise be so remote and alien to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it. That's a good overarching message of openness for sure.
So tell us, for the benefit of our listeners, where your exhibition is, for how long, and you mentioned your website. Can you please also tell us what that website is?
Yeah. Well, it's in Granary Square in King's Cross in London, and it's laid out in a linear fashion. So you can walk from London to Beijing or Beijing to London, depending on which end of the exhibition you approach it from. And there are markings on the floor so you can see where you are and you can see where to go to next, so that you can take this journey yourself. And it's up until the 16th of June. And then we're hopeful it will be extended, but in a new location just round the corner in Lewis Cubitt Square. And for more information on it, there's a website called www.silkroad-livinghistory.org. And there will be all the information about the exhibition and the talks around it. There's a workshop program, so you can come and do an introductory course on Islamic geometry or Ottoman calligraphy or whatever, or the geometric patterns of Samarkand. And we're doing that in partnership with the Prince's Foundation School of Traditional Arts, which is exciting, and more information about the bazaar as well there. So please do visit.
I look forward to it, and thank you, Christopher, for your time. It's been delightful listening to you and imagining what it would be like without seeing your photos.
Thank you, Seif. It's been a pleasure talking to you too, and thanks to everyone for listening.